Chasing Leviathan is a podcast about pursuing truth, one big question at a time through the discipline of listening. Truth is too big to tame, but if we pay close attention, we might get the chance to glimpse something truly magnificent. So please join me in this pursuit, 1 week at a time. Hello and welcome to Chasing Leviathan. I'm your host, PJ Wehry, and I'm here today with Dr. Melanie Marotta, lecturer in the Department of English and Language Arts at Morgan State University. Dr. Marotta, Melanie, wonderful to have you on the show today.
Nice to see you too. This is great.
And today we're talking about your book, African American Adolescent Female Heroes, the 21st Century Young Adult Neo-Slave Narrative. And I will ask you to kind of like walk us through all those terms, but first, why this book?
Why this book? No one's ever done it before. Now, as I say that, somebody's going to say, oh, I did this, right? That's always the way it works. I did it. Yeah. No one has ever done this area before. So my PhD is in African American Women's Lit, and I can hear somebody's fire alarm going off.
No worries.
An apartment. Okay, good. Is in African American Women's Lit from Morgan State, and my dissertation chair was Dr. Ruth T. Sheffy, who's one of the foremost authorities on Zora Neale Hurston in the world. So ultimately, she's the person to ask, and I see her a few times a year. She has an endowed lectureship, and this year's talk was about promoting Black women. And so I wrote my dissertation based on my interest in African American women's lit and the impact of environment. And it inevitably fell in. It's one of those things when you're an academic that once in a while you'll fall into something, and young adult literature was not my area, right? I always did adult literature. I did children's literature and some YA at the University of Guelph, where my undergrad's from. And it's just one of those funny things that you end up responding to a call for papers and kind of fall into this area. But you're always expanding your area of interest, right? I certainly hope so. I certainly hope so, right? If not, you get stale, and you can't teach students the way that they should be taught. And you always want to make sure that you're updating. In October, so this weekend, because it's Labor Day, I'll ultimately be working on finishing my conference presentation for PAMLA at the end of October, which is the Pacific and Ancient Modern Language Association, and that presentation will be on 2 new books that came out last year, and is part of a chapter in my upcoming book that's due for the wonderful University Press of Mississippi in February. So the fact is, you should always be, and it's on Black horror. You should always be updating what it is that you're doing. So I responded to, as inevitably happens, in 2014 a call for papers about YA, and I thought, I can branch out and think about, rather than adult literature, what about adolescence, and what is it that could be of interest? And it took me, so it came out this year. I started in 2014. This is the book, right? I mean, I did 2 books in between.
Hey, at least you finished it, right? It's not... Yeah.
I finished. Yes, I finished, and now I'm working on, and I say that about the next one, and I'm finishing now. That's due in February. I responded to this call for papers, and I thought, hey, this will be, and I do African American Women's Lit and the Neo-Slave Narrative, and have always found it to be an integral area. I mean, everybody knows who Octavia Butler is, right? And Octavia Butler is and her kindred is the book. And I remember reading it in grad school. I had this wonderful professor, Dr. Carter, who she put Kindred on the reading list, and it was like, light bulbs go off, and oh my goodness, this is the book, right? And this is the book that everybody should read. And then, of course, FX I still haven't watched it because I don't know, right? They did that, I know, and you always want to. It's the same thing. Toni Morrison, of course, wrote the Neo-Slave narrative with Beloved, and there is a movie, and I don't know. It's like, I love adaptations, but do you really want to, sully the love that you have for this book with,
yeah.
like here it is, and do you really want to do that? So I put a pin in the series and really didn't want to touch it just yet, but I studied the neo-slave narrative and the slave narrative, and of course, Henry Louis Gates Jr., who's the guy, right? And of course, he's on PBS for his series, but he's the guy that does the analysis of these integral texts that are so important to not just American history, right? But and again, I'm a Canadian American, so but worldwide history, right? That as we talk about Florida, that ultimately there's this erasure of this body of American history, and again, if you will, worldwide history, that just can't happen. That yesterday, this week is the anniversary of the march, right? And ultimately yesterday was the anniversary of Emmett Till. And of course, if you've gone down to the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture, right? One must go to see the Emmett Till exhibit and see see the atrocities that have been documented by this wonderful museum, and we have to remember, right? And like I said, kind of falling into YA, I was always doing the slave narrative and neo-slave narrative, and did for my dissertation. And of course, you always continue on what you're working on with your dissertation for your students and for your research and ultimately for your teaching. But going into YA, I thought, why isn't anybody doing this with this, right? And what is going on? Why is nobody looking at young adult literature as neo-slave narratives? Is this because it tends to be an adult area? Again, with Octavia Butler, right? Gail Jones, with of course Toni Morrison. Is this ultimately something that adults deal with only? And why? Why is that the case? And especially now with so many texts coming out for children as a reminder, right? That this is something that we need to learn about in school, and make sure that ultimately history cannot be forgotten. So I looked around and thought, okay, nobody's doing this. Why is nobody doing this? So I started poking around, and I found, and science fiction is one of my areas, and spec fic, right? Super fun, right? How is that not fun? And I know I haven't, in horror now too. I haven't seen the new Dracula movie, and I would love to. All right, it looks amazing. And I keep telling my students, because I teach vampires too, I'm like, somebody has to go and see this movie and tell me how it is, because especially because this weekend was like $4 movie day. I was like, somebody went, right? But no, everybody went to see Blue Beetle, right? Superheroes. Always superheroes. But I looked around and I was doing my research, and I found a blog from a mom, and I've since never been able to find that blog again, but she was out of Georgia, and she said, nobody writes books for my kids. And why is that, right? The blogger was an African-American woman who said, nobody's writing books for my kids. My kids are not represented in text. Why is this the case? Like, what's going on? So I started poking around more because, again, we're dealing, 13 to 17 age range. And there are those who say, like, YA is just slap a label on it so we can ultimately market it, right? And go, and go the big buck route, right? But it is a real genre, right? Because ultimately, adolescents need to see themselves in text. So I started poking around and thought, where is the YA spec fic featuring African-American young women? Why is this not the case? And it took me a really long time and actually until about 2019, it was few and far between. Major publishers weren't doing it. So I thought, nope. Can't have that, right? Don't want to do Harry Potter again. Nobody needs to see any more Harry Potter theory. Let's do, but and that's the other thing. Like, why do we do the same old, right? And so I wrote the book. It took me, conference presentations, took a chapter out at one point, because, hey, finished it during the pandemic, because that's when you write a book, right? And thought, no, don't like this chapter, but added a new one. The last chapter actually was my newest and freshest, and wanted to make sure that, because again, these books take time, right? And as a result, I didn't want to be doing all books from this time range. I wanted to go as recent as humanly possible. And that's the same thing with the book I'm writing now. Everything is really recent because I want to say 2019 kind of kicked it off, right? Like 2023. I teach women and gender studies too, right? So 2023 really, Pride Month happened and there was like a boom of YA queer texts. And it was like, wow, publishers are catching on and putting out these books. And the same thing happened with YA spec fic. All of a sudden you got really some excellent works. And I really wanted to highlight these are the books that are out there, right? And in some of this, I was the first person that published about these books. So bringing attention, making sure, authors get credit where credit is due, but hopefully that other teachers will integrate those texts in their teaching as well. So that's how I fell into it. There's a long explanation.
No. But ultimately it was for that mom in Georgia, right? Like that, right?
Yeah.
And it's about why, and you're like, I'm going to find them and I'm going to make sure they get spread. But something you mentioned multiple times, and I wanted to, before we move into your book, because I do want to talk about that, you talked about why it's important not to stagnate or become stale for pedagogical reasons. Why? And I just had someone on talk about pedagogy in the new college classroom, all that sort of thing. But I'd love to hear from you. Why is it important to, if I'm understanding you correctly, why is it important to continually grow personally and in your studies if you're going to teach your students well?
You can't teach the same thing over and over again, right? And so long ago, it used to be you could be a university professor and you could focus your entire career on one writer. And you did this one writer and this is what you did. And your entire career was based on this and you were the person, right? Well, over time, due to job, right? But not just, hiring and education. I always seem to be talking about this. We're facing terrible cuts, especially in the humanities. And people are really pushing that, the humanities aren't important anymore. It's like, they are. It's the study of people. And ultimately, we're making sure that when you go out into the workforce, that you can you have CAT skills, critical and analytical thinking skills. We're making sure that you can ultimately argue for yourself, right? Going out and making sure that your voice is heard at work. So as an instructor, that just didn't fly anymore. You can't just do one writer. So you have to, spread this out and have to do even more and become, ultimately, in a way, you should be an expert in as many areas as humanly possible. I'm doing, like I said, for October, Black horror. Horror was not my area, right? It just, it wasn't. I'm writing on Tiffany, and I love Tiffany Jackson so much. Tiffany Jackson's The Weight of Blood. I'm writing on that for October. I wrote for last year's Pamela presentation about Tiffany Jackson's White Smoke, which is an African American YA Gothic novel, and it's amazing. And I got to hear it at the Library of Congress Book Festival last year, and had my picture taken, and got my autograph and everything. It was wonderful. And I was like, oh, I fangirled out, right? But I mean, horror was not my area. It's science fiction and Western. Justified City Primeval will be on tonight, and I'll totally be watching that because I have an essay coming out in the journal College Literature about Elmer Leonard's work, right? But you can't just do, okay, well, I'm going to do 3 things. I'm always going to do 3 things, and it's only going to be 3 things. And this is what I'm going to do for my entire career, because it's no good it isn't any good for your students. And for yourself, you're going to do the same old always, right? No, in order to grow as a person and as an educator, we're always reading, we're always learning. We go to conferences, in person so that we can not only listen to other presenters, present on their area of expertise, but also so we can, go to the meet and greet and talk to people later and get to talk about their work and learn all about, so that ultimately we can integrate those areas into our teaching too. During the pandemic, again, like, this is the time to do stuff. I took a course that I've been teaching, and I thought, I think I'm going to put a theme on this course, so now I'm teaching vampires. And so I have,
Why not? Yeah.
And there you go. Why not, right? Everybody, other professors had themes for their course, and I thought, hey, so I do Gothic literature. I've been doing Gothic literature for a while. I have an essay coming out next year in the Routledge Handbook for Transgender Literature about transgender Gothic literature. I have an essay that, after I finish this one, I'll finish the other one for an encyclopedia about transgender YA literature, contemporary American. But again, you always stay in your wheelhouse, but don't, right? You always stay here, but you have to go over here, because not only what if these students are in your class, but also, am I only supposed to do, late 20th century American literature for the rest of my life? No, right? Because that was my dissertation. No. You have to as a person, but also as an educator, you always have to continue to adapt. So, for the new round of first year students, I looked at how I designed the course, and I thought, this last book, I don't know if it worked. I thought it was okay. It was a really good vampire neo-slave narrative, but they didn't really seem to like it as much. So I swapped it out, and I'll be putting in African American queer vampire, right? Because that's fun, right? And again, right? Not only why not, but you have to make sure your students are represented. So I try to hit as many areas as I can. I start with Polidori and go all the way up to something that came out, 3 years ago? That way ensuring, again, not just representation, but that we're always current and we're always up on current theories. But again, as a teacher and a person, you must, right?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, it's good to always hear like the different perspectives on that. But you've mentioned this even now. You've talked about slave narratives and neo-slave narratives. Do you mind articulating what those two are and the difference between them?
Oh, sure. So it depends on where you are as well. So slave narratives either tend to come from British enslavement or tend to come from American enslavement, right? The difference in between the two, and the most famous, of course, Mary Prince and Equiano, connected to British enslavement. Slave narratives that tend to come from British enslavement tend to be from formerly enslaved persons, right? Remember, and for everybody listening, we don't say slave anymore. You don't use that terminology anymore, right? Because a slave ultimately is a noun. Being an enslaved person is different, right? This is more talking about, using it as, here's me as an English instructor, right? As an adjective, right? Rather than this is the whole person, which is what a slave was, what that means, right? Instead, as an enslaved person, you're reminding everyone that these were people. This was the condition. Was enforced upon them, and in Britain's case, they were stolen from their homes and forced into enslavement. The difference with American enslavement, it tends to be, I'm in Baltimore, right? Frederick Douglass. Okay. Frederick Douglass is everywhere. One direction you get Edgar Allan Poe, the other direction you get Fells Point, you get Frederick Douglass, right? And of course the museum and the Smithsonian, the Sam Museum, in the Portrait Gallery have just placed his daguerreotype in his portrait. I've seen the portrait, haven't seen the daguerreotype before. Back on exhibit, right? Like again, here's Frederick Douglass, but it's a really young Frederick Douglass, and not the stern, right? And again, the photo, the image was taken for a reason, right? But ultimately, this is a reminder, and I put his Frederick Douglass as a young man, when I teach Frederick Douglass, into my teaching to remind students, like, this is how young he was. But again, with American enslavement, it was, these are people who were born into enslavement, and this is all they knew, right? Because you do get persons who say, well, why didn't they just leave? Really? And go where? Right? And with what? These are, if you read Frederick Douglass's narrative, he was born in Maryland. There he was. This is, here's this plantation that he spent, his formative years on. He ultimately was taught and taught himself, mostly learned how to read and write. And as a result, it assisted him in escaping, because it had to be, it was an escape. He had to leave, or inevitably death, right? Like, this is not, hey, he could just walk away one day and, everything is just peachy, right? And again, you get people who just like, oh yeah, they should have just, how? Right? It wasn't going to happen. People died. And ultimately, these texts should be taught in schools, and we're seeing so much where either people are A, banning them, or B, putting these warnings on these texts, right? Or C, doing what some universities are and saying, well, if you find this triggering, you don't have to read this. You can read something else. And really, no. Everybody should be reading Frederick Douglass's text, or everybody should be reading, Mary Prince's text. Ultimately, ensuring that we all know and remember that these people existed, and here's what happened, that they're only writing these texts, or somebody was writing these texts for them because they couldn't read and they couldn't write, that these texts existed to get people ultimately to support the abolitionist movement, right? Again, I always point to Henry Louis Gates, always go to his works, right? Because he's the guy and he's written extensively. But so what happened was, eventually 20th century writers thought, okay, well, I mean, ultimately we can't forget, but how can we take this experience, this historical moment, this atrocity that happened on American soil, and how can we place this in a modern contemporary text, right? And of course, you get Margaret Walker's Jubilee, you get Octavia Butler's Kindred, you get Toni Morrison's Beloved, right? Gail Jones, again, one of my favorite writers. Wrote my dissertation on her too. Writing about her now. Her Birdcatcher is amazing. But how can you take this experience and write about it from a contemporary perspective and write about it for a contemporary audience? Well, you create the neo-slave narrative, right? And ultimately, what this work does is you are... Bless you.
It's always two. I literally just sitting there waiting for the second one. Sorry.
That's okay. It's pollen season, and with your weather, I'm sure you're just not getting away with it. No. It's the same thing here, and with the humidity, it's the same thing here. But with the neo-slave narrative, the difference is that not only are you writing about it from a modern contemporary perspective and for a contemporary audience, but also you can take this structure and offer characters agency that they wouldn't have had before, power over their lives, right? Making sure that characters have a voice. And that's really what the young adult perspective does, right? Not only brings, and I focus on American. We'll leave British for now. I did work on one writer who teaches in North Carolina, Hartley, but ultimately, and he is British. But my works were American.
Forgive me one second. Part of it was me sneezing, but I just want to make sure. So as you were talking about the slave versus neo-slave, part of it, the distinction is that in the neo-slave narratives, they were able to create more agency and more voice for their characters. That's part of the distinction, obviously you have more of a historical setting and you have a more of a speculative setting. Is that kind of some of the distinctions? Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
I'm sure you explained it really well. I was sneezing and I was like, shoot, I think that was it. All right, everything.
That's all right. and with the slave narrative too, Robert Steptoe wrote this, excellent book, where he laid out different types of different structures of slave narratives, but ultimately, they were written for people in the abolition movement, right? And hopefully attempting to urge people to vote, right? To enact law to make sure that enslavement on American soil, that enslavement was abolished, right? So you're getting, particularly with Frederick Douglass, so they used his was the most popular slave narrative of all time. His sold 30,000 copies, and every text that came after that point was really modeled on, here's this trajectory. So when you get neo-slave narratives, you'll see that similar trajectory. Ultimately, the escape and going north, it is the end, and that's where it ends off. These are first-person narrations, telling the reader, here's what happened, and really urging them to enact change. You have a voice, you need to use this, right? Neo-slave narrative tended to really come out later 20th century, around, and again, we talked about civil rights movement today with the anniversary, around that time period. And again, it's not only just a reminder of American history, but offering African-American writers, offering their characters voices they may not have had before. And no longer the work ends with if you will, the escape and going north. A lot of the time, that part happens in the beginning. So you get to see what you didn't see before, which here's the life afterwards, right? I mean, Frederick Douglass is the guy, right? I mean, he's one of my most favorite writers of all time. He's the guy, right? And you got to learn, you got to learn a lot about, especially with his career as an abolitionist, right? Ultimately, his connection with the University of Rochester, right? They have their institute there, because he went to Rochester, New York. The fact is, you got to see a lot of his life afterwards, right? After the first book, and he wrote extensively after that point. But a lot of formerly enslaved people, you didn't, right? It was one book, and then it ended here, and then you didn't really learn what happened, right? So this is a chance for writers to say, this is not the end, right? That enslaved people, this is not the end. Here's the life afterwards. Here's what happened. Here's how enslavement remains impactful, right? And right now, systemic racism and critical race theory ultimately is getting, there are those who want to, take that little pink dollar store eraser and erase everything and rewrite everything, right? And we can't forget. And so these writers are ensuring, and again, it's a spec fic, text, right? There are those people who still say, like, Octavia Butler's neo-slave narrative is not the serious one because there was science fiction in it. She traveled through time. So therefore it's not literature, right? It's like, really? Because there's science fiction? No, right? You just get to do more. And you get to do different things, right? You get to travel through time. You get to do different things. And this is a way for her character, Dana, to look back on her past and see how ultimately she came to be and to remember the ancestors, right?
Even as you're talking here about, like, slave narratives always ended with the escape to the north, and neo-slave is about people continuing on after that. Some of that goes back to this distinction you're making between slave and enslaved person, right? Because it's like, oh, your story ends when you stop being a slave because that's how you were defined. When you talk about enslaved person, it's like, oh, now I've gotten out of the enslavement. I'm still a person. I still have a story. It keeps going, right? And is that part of the connection there? Am I tracking with you?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Oh, for sure, right? And again, the slave narrative, Frederick Douglass is so impactful because he reminds his readership that he is a person, right? That's why his is really the go-to. I mean, if you're a teacher and you're I'm going to take a little aside and say this, and this would be the second book I put together with a colleague, Susan Flynn. We did a critical pedagogical text about ensuring that DEI was in classrooms. Like, in other words, if you're not entirely sure, don't worry about it. Don't be nervous about it. Just do it, right? Because that's what happens sometimes too. Teachers don't want to branch out because they're nervous they're going to make a mistake. And then, the court of public opinion is going to, right, here's what happened, and you're going to, right, and that's inevitably what's going to happen. So people get afraid that what if I make a mistake and it doesn't work? And the fact is, you gotta do it, right? You gotta do the leap, and you gotta do it. And Frederick Douglass is a good starting point, because besides his work has it all, right? Ultimately, his text embodies rhetoric and the argument. But even before he can argue that enslavement has to be abolished, he has to argue and prove to his readership that he's a person, right? Because to many people at the time, he wasn't considered to be a person; he was considered to be property. So with the neo-slave narratives, it's personal, right? You get to see that ultimately these characters are people. They have agency. They have emotions. They're people, right? And I keep saying that for a reason. And you know, that ultimately, and this is something that we should read. So it's got science fiction, right? That just makes it more fun,
I'm a science fiction fan, so you're preaching to the choir here. Like, I read way too much speculative fiction, so.
Right, so Justine Ireland's texts have zombies in it, right? You know what I mean? Like, you know, hey, right? That just adds to the fun of the thing, right? And of course, zombies are all representative too. I teach a little zombie one now and again. You know,
little dabbling.
Right, guys, that into.
I wanted to go. You mentioned this earlier. It's not it is a very intentional choice and a very important one that these slave and neo-slave narratives are told in the first person. Because in third person, you could keep that property distinction, but first person that's a stylistic, that shows like, you're like, oh my gosh, this is like I'm living inside this person's head, and it makes people uncomfortable, right? And I have to ask you this, I apologize. What is DEI?
Oh, diversity, equity, and inclusivity.
Okay, got it.
Different countries have different short forms. Like Europe does EDI. It's the same thing. Ultimately, all it means is just a fancy term, which means make sure your students are shown in your courses. Yeah. Right. Make sure that there's representation there. That everybody has a chance to see themselves in books, in literature, in television, that there's representation, that people are there. Well,
and that the students get to meet people who are different than themselves, because that's a big part of education, right? Like,
oh yeah. Exactly, right? And that's the thing, right? That's the whole purpose of going to university, right? You go to university, you branch out, you meet new people in your class, right? But you also meet them in the text that you're reading. I'm designing a Canadian literature course now, and I mean, hey, I could do the same old stuff, right? Or, okay, I could put Silvia Moreno Garcia's Mexican Gothic in the course. I mean, she is the number one Gothic novelist, right now. Like, she's amazing, and she writes, she's Canadian and Latinx, and here's her perspective, and here's her text, right? Indigenous horror is booming right now, and because it's awesome, right? And of course, course, right? We're going to make sure that as I'm designing this course, this is going to be Indigenous representation. And I mean, and again, from the education perspective, I have a background in Indigenous literature. I did it in undergrad at the University of Guelph. Right, I did it American literature-wise when I did my master's. And as we, today, after we finish speaking, I'm going to go back to my course that I'm taking from the University of Alberta on Indigenous Canada, so that, I'm all up to date and make sure that I can include the Indigenous experience in the course that I'm designing, because you have to. Right. And again, just like you said, you have to introduce students to experiences that may not be their own in order to ultimately, in order to be a well-rounded person, you have to learn about everybody's experience and know right? So that you can go out and work and ultimately be, well, respectful and inclusive and make sure that when in doubt in the world that we're in today, kindness does actually matter, right? But representation matters always.
Yeah, and part of the reason I brought that up, one, of course, it's important that students be able to see themselves. But I mentioned beforehand, I grew up through high school an hour and a half north of Green Bay, Wisconsin. And so if you had designed the course based on students seeing themselves, it would have just been all white, because that's it was a town of 600. Okay. There was that, but I was grateful that I was able to read, especially in a town of 600, you're like, wow, this is, it can be really different, when Walmart is your main source of entertainment, it's really good to have your horizons broadened, right? Anyways, that's near and dear, those reasons are obviously contradictory. They work together. They're complementary, right? Actually, and I did want to mention this because I actually had a friend who just went to Germany, and I think sometimes, you're talking about people are trying to erase things, and it's a lot easier to see the foibles in other people, the other people's problems and why they should do what they're doing. But he talked about walking, and I believe they were slightly raised up. They might not have been, but every place that there were Jews who had been taken away in the Holocaust, as he walked through Berlin, there was a brick with the what they did, what was there, and their names. And when you talk to German people, they're incredibly self-conscious about that, or maybe historically conscious would be better, not self-conscious. That has psychological overtones I'm not looking for. They're historically conscious about that, and that needs to not be repeated, right? And so when you look at that, you're like, well, yeah, and so when we look at that, we're like, that's obvious. But here it's become this well, we don't want to trigger people, you know what I mean? And it's well, that'd be better than doing it again. I'm just saying, anyways, so I don't know if that parallel works, but I find it helpful to look at other cultures where it's easier to see other people mess up.
Oh, I know in Germany, which I've never been, unfortunately. The fact is that they refuse to let anybody forget, and that's the way it should be, right? They got rid of all the monuments of, right? Those have gone away, but they're making sure, that ultimately anti-Semitism, which is a huge problem right now, and that this just can't happen in Germany, right? That the fact remains that people are remembered, and people are remembered for a reason, because we just can't let this continue, and that ultimately, in Germany especially, you get punished by law if you but with all the talk in the U.S., right? I went to Broadway in the spring, right? And theater, the big issue and most of the plays were about anti-Semitism, right? I saw, Tom Stoppard's Leopoldstadt, which came over from the UK, which documents the Holocaust, right? And it's important for public perspective that the humanities continues to remember and to represent important issues to us. Like I said, I talked about Indigenous literature. Indigenous literature is important. Indigenous horror is hot, but it's more than that, right? It's the fact that we have to remember. Like I said, I'm from Canada. You have to remember the residential schools, and I bring up issues to my students here, and they're like, "What's a residential school?" Right? And it's like, this was a horrible thing that lasted well into the 90s in Canada, where Indigenous children were taken from their homes, and they were forced into these schools, taken away from their families, and they weren't allowed their culture, they weren't allowed their language, clothing, see families, and they were forced into this situation. They're forced into this atrocity, which the Pope has last summer came to Canada and called it genocide. And ultimately, this is what we see in Indigenous writers' works right now, that they're making sure, again, from a horror perspective, right, utilize the genre to reflect reality, to bring it to a wider audience.
Yeah, absolutely. That was such a good point. I had something I was going to say about something earlier, but I wanted to sit with that for a second. That's really, yeah, that, I mean, and it's amazing how recent that is. You know what I mean? Even as we look at this, as we talk about this. Oh, now I remember what I was going to say. Now I feel bad because it was a joke. So, like, definitely, it was. I was going to mention. I was like, I apologize for the Harry Potter reference, but I did really enjoy that you gave Hitler the Voldemort treatment. That's. Yes, like, you know who? Yes, I was like, but the I
tend to you're CNN's on the background. You're the Florida governor's there. I kind of do that with him too. You know that guy who keeps that's what I talk about him in class. You know that guy keeps banning stuff. Remember him, right? Who is trying to decimate AP courses because, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? Ass, right? Like, ultimately, I tend to use the Voldemort who treatment because I can't.
Don't want to say it. Yeah, that's funny.
So, and Stephen Colbert does the same thing, right? If you ever, when we get television back again, every time Stephen Colbert talks about the former president, he does the same thing, right? Calls him something other than and never uses his name. It's like, yeah, exactly. Harry Potter thing. And that's a whole loaded other issue. You don't want to go into other stuff. I know. Everything is just
everything's so exciting. Actually, and I want to be respectful of your time, and we didn't get to talk. I think we got to talk about the concepts around your book. We didn't get to really delve into it. I'm okay with that. I've really enjoyed our discussion. For our audience, what is one takeaway you would have for this week? Like, not that, like, obviously, I'm not asking you to summarize everything we just talked about because that was a lot and it was great. But what is something you'd have them to think further on, or something to do this week after listening to this episode?
Oh, that's interesting. All right. What could you do? Read one of the authors. Honestly, read one of the authors that I wrote about. Because some, like Justina Ireland is really well known, right? I heard her talk, Charm City Speculative Fiction Society had her come to one of their meetings pre-pandemic, and I got to listen to her read from her book, and it was amazing, right? It's always great when you get to hear the author, but she's more, I'm going to say, well-known than others. Read one of the books, right? That's my takeaway. Read, support your author. Whether you get it from, support your library, please support your library, because again, that's the other thing that people are trying to take away. And it's like, we love our libraries, right? It is our refuge. It's a wonderful place. But ultimately, read one of the books. And especially if this is not a genre that you usually pick up, right? Like, everybody has their favorite thing, right? I love mysteries, I really do. Only Murders in the Building is on tonight. I'm all over that. But especially if this is a genre that you're not used to, or you don't tend to pick up, go for it. Try it out, read, and honor the writers who have created these texts, and honor more specifically the people in American history that should be honored. What
a great way to end us. I think that's a great, that call to expand our boundaries, to expand our empathy and our memory, I think is a great way to end today. Thank you so much for coming on today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I had a great time. This is wonderful.